What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to XJW Diaries. My name is Justin. So they say that our brain is not fully developed until we reach the age of 25, 26 years old. And up to that point, we go through all these different stages of mental development. And so that brings up a question. How are those mental development stages impacted when somebody is born and raised as a Jehovah's Witness? Now, obviously, that is way too big of a subject to handle in one video, but it's still worth at least dipping our toes into, especially because I am definitely a believer that the more you understand the weapons that were used against you, the easier it will be to overcome those things and heal from those things. And for people out there that have family members that are still stuck in the witnesses, the more you understand how their own mind has been turned against them, the easier it will be to reach them. So again, we're just going to dip our toes into this for a little bit, but let's just see if being born and raised as a Jehovah's Witness does have any impact on your mental development stages. Now let's start things off with a brand new newborn baby. Now, according to governing body member Stephen Lett, this newborn baby is a little enemy of God.
Now, if we think about it, we're not born as friends of God because we're born as sinful offspring of Adam. Actually, if you think about it, we're born as enemies of God. Sometimes you'll hear people say of a little baby, "Look at that little angel." But more accurate would be to say, "Look at that little enemy of God."
Now, I'm sure he regrets saying that, or at least I hope he regrets saying that, because he's making it way too easy for us. But needless to say, I definitely disagree with that. I think that when you are a newborn baby, that's probably the most perfect that you can be. I mean, think about it. You are pure innocence. You can't even think of something bad, because in order to think, in order to contemplate something, you have to have a language. And as a newborn baby, you don't have a language, so you can't even think bad. You are purely just the observer, the most pure you that you can ever be. Nobody has told you who you are, what you're good at, what you're bad at. Nobody has put any labels on you. And furthermore, nobody's put any labels on the world around you, or this system of things, as the witnesses would put it. So you have no choice but to just observe the world around you with no judgment. Now, at this point, the child is too young for the Watchtower to have any real impact on their mental development. But even just the practice of taking the child to the meetings, taking the baby out in service even, is still giving the baby those experiences. And each of those experiences is having some imprint on the child and building their view of what is normal. So now let's move forward in time to the 2 to 4-year-old range. Now, this is where the Watchtower can really begin to dig in their nails and have an impact on the person's mental development. There's a whole lot that happens in this age range. And again, we're just dipping on our toes, but I want to at least bring out a couple big developments. So the first big development during these ages is that the child is learning how to speak. Now, for most kids, the way they learn how to speak is by watching TV, listening to their parents, getting read to at night, things like that. All of those things work together to help this child build a vocabulary, learn how to form sentences, and speak. But for a Jehovah's Witness child, they also have those 2 meeting nights a week, and family study, and service. And then, of course, you also have the Caleb and Sophia videos, things like that, and just the general way that Jehovah's Witnesses speak, which means that the Watchtower can have a very big impact on this child's vocabulary. Now, that's a double-edged sword because your vocabulary not only impacts how you speak, but it also impacts the way that you think. And for a child, it will also impact the way that they play. Now, I've seen this with my own eyes, watching young kids at my old hall play with their toys as if their toys are going through Armageddon or going into paradise. Whereas a child raised outside of the witnesses might play in a way that's inspired by their favorite TV show or their favorite nighttime story. So already, the Watchtower is having a major impact on this young child and their imagination. Now, the other even bigger thing that happens between 2 to 4 years old is the birth of the ego, that sense of self. This is why people often talk about the terrible twos and having troubles with their toddlers, because around this age, the ego is being born. And that child is moving out of that selfless observer mode and moving into a more selfish mode. Now, not selfish in a bad way, but just selfish in a way that they're stepping into their sense of self. And of course, being raised a Jehovah's Witness means that the Watchtower has had an opportunity to have a very big impact on that child's sense of self, their ego. So now we move forward in time again, this time to the 5 to 7-year-old range. Now, this is another age range where a lot is going on. There's a lot of great mental development steps happening. And one of the big things that these mental development steps is enabling is that the child can begin to learn how to read and write. And for the Watchtower, that means that the child can begin to do their own studying. Now, as I mentioned in another video, what Jehovah's Witnesses call studying is really just a mental conditioning exercise. That's really all it is. They give you some information based on their views. Then they tell you how you should feel about that information. And then they ask you how you feel. And then you repeat to them how they told you you should feel. Now, that has a big impact on full-grown adults. So just imagine how much of an impact that has on a young child whose mind is like a sponge. This is also the age range where the child is beginning to develop primitive reasoning skills and the intuitive thought process. They're starting to wonder why things are the way they are, why the world is the way it is. And of course, the Watchtower is more than happy to tell them why things are the way they are and why the world is the way it is. And of course, their view is because the world is coming to an end. So imagine this child just started their life and now they're having to face the idea that the world is coming to an end. So already at this point, the Watchtower has had a big impact on how this child sees the world, how they think, and even how they speak. Now, they say that up to 90% of our subconscious thinking patterns, our personality, our automatic actions, all stem from development between ages 1 to 7. This is when they say your mind is wide open. You're like a sponge soaking up information. This is why these young kids can learn a language so easily. Now, with all of that in mind, you gotta wonder, what impact does the Watchtower have on these young kids when they go to meetings? Again, we're talking about a child only as old as 7 years old. And the Watchtower does not separate children from adults at the meetings. So these young 7-year-old kids go to these meetings and they hear subjects, and they're expected to pay attention to subjects being discussed that have no business being discussed around a 6-7-year-old child. Now, again, this child is in a stage of their development where they're just soaking up information. So what impact does that have when a child is soaking up information that is adult subjects, that their mind does not have the maturity yet to be able to process? What effect does that have? These are the type of things that we have to think about that the Watchtower does not think about. And it just goes to show, in yet another case, how they are not putting things into consideration for the children that are in their organization. So now let's move forward into the 8 to 10-year-old range. Now, by this point, the ego, that sense of self, is pretty well formed, and now we begin the maturing process. So during this stage, the child begins to develop the ability to do inductive reasoning. This is basically where the child is beginning to learn how to use evidence, or the things that are true the majority of the time, to basically forecast into the future. So in other words, this is the age when you learn how to assume things. And of course, when they make these assumptions, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be based on the worldview that the Watchtower gave them. Because by this time, this child has had the way they view themselves and the way they view the world around them completely influenced by how the Watchtower wants them to see those things. So now let's move up to the 11 to 14-year-old range. Now, this one is interesting for me because that's the age that I was, 11 years old, when my family joined the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, at this point in the development, the child can begin to do abstract thinking. And that's a big deal when it comes to the Jehovah's Witnesses, because a lot of their beliefs require you to do mental gymnastics. So in other words, during this age, the child can begin to, as they say, make the truth their own. And it's kind of ironic that, at least in my area, it's during this age range that you start to see more kids become unbaptized publishers and start to move towards baptism. They start to give answers in their own words, things like that. So now let's move forward one last time to the 15 to 18-year-old range. And really this goes all the way out to 25, 26 years old. But the majority of the development takes place right in that 15 to 18-year-old range. Now, there's a lot of things that happen during this range, but one of the most important things that happens is a person begins to develop their sense of identity, their own persona. So whereas the ego is that sense of core self, the persona is the mask that you put over that. They're starting to choose how they want to present themselves to the world. What really matters to them, what's right and wrong, what's responsible or irresponsible according to their own views, or at least what they think of as their own views. But of course, the Watchtower has had a very big impact on their views. Another big development is your sexual maturity. In this age range, the teenagers, the young adults are starting to be more curious. But of course, in the Watchtower, you have a very sexually repressive culture, which means that natural curiosity is turned into something of guilt and shame. So you aren't really able to develop that way in a healthy way. And another big thing happening in this age range is you're starting to think more longer term. In fact, you're starting to make some long-term decisions at this age. And of course, your long-term decisions are going to be influenced by the Watchtower. And of course, the Watchtower believes that the world is going to end any day now. So if you're making a long-term decision, but you believe that the world is going to end any day now, the way you make that decision is going to be way different. Of course, one way that this comes into play is your career choice. When you're around that 17, 18-year-old range, people always come up to you and ask you, what is your plan for the future? What do you want to do with your life? What career path are you going to take? Now, for a non-Jehovah's Witness child, the ideas that pop up in their head about what career paths they can take is going to be mostly based off of their interest. Whereas for a Jehovah's Witness, the ideas that pop up in their head for the career paths that they can take will be influenced by what the Watchtower tells them they are allowed to have. So of course this means you can't pick any career path that's going to require a university degree. Because even though going to a university isn't a disfellowshipping offense, still in that culture it's so frowned upon. In that culture, you will be looked at as bad association, which means you will lose all your friends, which means you won't be able to date anybody. You won't get any privileges. You have elders constantly checking up on you. In some cases, in some households, you may be kicked out of your parents' home. And so for most Jehovah's Witness children in this age range, that's more than enough evidence to convince them to not even look down that path. So they're going to pick a career path that can work without a higher degree, which in some cases that's okay. But in other cases, that may not be what they would really want to do. In some cases, that may limit them in their income. And if your income is limited, that limits your experiences that you can have in your life. Traveling experiences, whether or not to have kids, where you live, how safe you feel where you live, can definitely be determined by how much money you can bring in. But again, to the Jehovah's Witness, they believe that the world is coming to an end any day now. And so therefore, if you have a job that you hate, that does not allow you to live somewhere that you love, does not allow you to live the lifestyle that you love, that's okay, because the world is going to end any day now, and then things will be perfect, and that job you hate will just be a distant memory. And it's a similar case when it comes to marriage. Marriage is another long-term, very serious decision. And again, that is viewed in the way that the Watchtower tells you to view it. So for a lot of these young Jehovah's Witness, young adults, they jump into a relationship before they even get a chance to know themselves. I mean, really, in my opinion, as a Jehovah's Witness, you never get a chance to really know yourself. Not on the deepest level that you really should. But regardless of that, they don't really get a chance to know themselves. They don't get a chance to know the other person. They rush into marriage. I mean, I've seen it happen within a few months, from hi, nice to meet you, to being engaged to someone that you hardly know. And of course, the Watchtower is telling you to look for qualities in these people that are only surface level. They want you to look for, they used to tell me, make sure you marry a pioneer sister. And of course, they're telling the woman, look for a brother that's a ministerial servant, a pioneer, maybe even an elder, as a determination of how good of a person they are. This is on the outside. This has nothing to do with what's in here. But that's what they tell you to look at. And so unfortunately, in many cases, unfortunately, it happens to the woman in the organization. They rush into marriage with somebody that they hardly know, looking for external qualities that the Watchtower told them to look for. And then they get stuck with somebody who is abusive, mentally unstable, has addiction issues, many other things. And because of the way that they view divorce, that young sister is now stuck with somebody that does not have her best interest. But of course, the end is coming soon though. And so that spouse that you rushed into marriage with, that you no longer love, guess what? The end of the system is coming any day now. And in that new system, the person that you married will now be perfect. You will now have a perfect version of your spouse. So for now, just deal with it. And then pretty soon, it'll all be fixed. So again, another example of if you believe that the world is ending, how you make long-term decisions is going to be very different. Now, again, we're just dipping our toes into this subject. You can already see probably just how big this would be if we were really going to dive into it. It probably would take several videos that are all multi-hours long. So I'm not going to do that. That's for somebody else. But at the very least, again, it's worth dipping our toes into it. And even just with dipping our toes into it, you can see very clearly that the Watchtower can have a very big impact on the development, the mental development of a person and the development of their sense of self and identity. Now, with that being said, I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing, especially for those of you watching that were born and raised as Jehovah's Witness. It might be a little unsettling to see all the ways that these people have been able to influence just your mental development. But if you ask me, I think even just the fact of talking about this and thinking about it, shining a light on it, can make you more aware of certain things that you do, certain patterns that you have that are influenced by the Watchtower. And just by being aware of these things, you might be able to correct course and reprogram yourself. There's a lot of power in awareness. And I've definitely seen proof of this in my own life. I've been able to deprogram myself from a lot of these Watchtower ways of seeing the world and behaving. Now, it's not a short process. In many ways, I'm still going through it. And it's entirely possible that, some of these things are just so deep that they do just become a core part of who you are. But even with those things, again, just shining a light on it, having awareness of it, you may be able to reverse them and reintegrate them into your life in a more healthy way. So I did a video not that long ago about the XJW advantage, some of the things that we had to go through as witnesses that if you change your thinking of them, you can actually use it as an advantage. So I think these mental development patterns that the Watchtower has instilled in us can have the same effect. It really just comes down to knowing how to do that mental alchemy to change these things into something positive that can actually work in your favor. So with all that being said, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned at least something from it. I know I certainly did just in making this video. It's very interesting to see the different stages that we go through and how our environment and our social structure can have an impact on these different stages. Now, for those of you that are going through the waking up process, if you have kids, hopefully this video really helps you out and you can see what development stage your child is at. Because the way that you can wake up a 7, 8-year-old kid is going to be very different than the way you might wake up a 13, 14-year-old child, which is also going to be different than the way you wake up somebody who's 17, 18 years old. So depending on their development, depending on the levels of how their brain can work, who knows, there may be a easier doorway for you to be able to reach them. That way you can be able to leave this organization with your whole family, rather than, having to be stuck PMO just to keep a relationship with your children. So that being said, hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time. Please take it easy on yourself. Seriously. Going through this process is crazy, so you got to take it easy on yourself. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.